Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 40,000, which is one of the games that we expect Creative Assembly to be announcing in December this year, alongside a historical title. They're also working on Alien Isolation, and that is something that they've publicly announced. 40k is just rumors, leaks, speculation at this point, and it's been speculated for years that CA would be doing a Total War Warhammer 40k. Now, the big question mark on them doing a Total War 40k game is not the campaign layer. It has to do a lot with battles. How do you handle the battles of 40k in a Total War game properly? Now, a lot of people are going to bring up the discussion of the engine, and a lot of people are also going to bring up the discussion of the specifics of battles. Well, here's my perspective on the engine. The engine can handle 40k battles. That's not really the issue. In fact, the engine can do much better than what we're currently seeing in Warhammer 3. And we know this because we have Free Kingdoms. We do have Pharaoh. We do have Troy. And what's consistent in every game that isn't Warhammer 3 at the moment, that those games run much better than Warhammer 3 does. That has to do a lot with Warhammer 3's development. So you have a bunch of different factions from 3 different games all put together in one game. You have a lot of different code from those games, and it's apparently an annoying process to deal with changes and the addition of new factions to the game. Mechanics breaking, AI breaking, the map breaking, many issues on that subject. But that's because spaghetti code doesn't even begin to describe what we currently have in Warhammer 3. But the engine is not the limiting factor. Do I believe they should use a new engine? Yes, I do so. Will they use a new engine? Well, that's a big question mark. The only thing we know on the possibility of them using a new engine is that CA has been hiring people with Unreal 5 experience, or they've had job postings for people with Unreal 5 experience, or Unreal Engine 5 experience, but that seems to be more aligned with Alien Isolation, because they're going to do Alien Isolation 2 in Unreal Engine 5. Whether or not they would switch to using Unreal Engine 5 for Total War, that's obviously a big question mark. But I think the engine is not the problem. Even if they still keep using the Warscape engine, sure, there's changes, additions, etc. I think there would be a huge benefit in using a new engine in many ways. But at the same time, I don't think it's the limiting factor. Of course, if they did switch to a new engine, they could potentially do far larger scale than anything we've ever seen in a Total War game to date. For instance, we have Ultimate Battle Simulator 1 and 2, and those are games where you can have not just thousands of troops, but hundreds of thousands of troops, millions even, if we're looking at Ultimate Battle Simulator 2. And those games do run on current systems. You don't need the ultimate super powerful computer. You can actually run a lot of battles, huge battles even in those games, especially Ultimate Battle Simulator 2, on a lower end computer. So that is obviously something that is available on the market right now. And keep in mind, Ultimate Battle Simulator 2 is not made by a huge team of hundreds of developers like Creative Assembly has working on the next Total War games. It's made by a very small development team. In fact, I believe there's one guy that's handling the core development of that. So just gonna point out, the technology is clearly out there from a performance standpoint and a scale standpoint. Now, some will counter saying, well, what would be the point, what would be the value proposition in having a Total War game with millions of troops in a single battle? Well, beyond the fact that it would be freaking awesome and it would certainly match what 40k does in some of those battles, it could also allow other things to happen. Like, for instance, a more dynamic experience and smoother experience between the campaign layer and battles. So you could have the campaign, but when you go into a battle between two armies, you just zoom in. And that's about maybe the campaign slows down. Sure, fair enough, things are done slower, or the campaign inherently is slower versus how troops fight on the battlefield. This, I think, would work very well for, say, a planet. You know, you're fighting one faction on a planet, your armies collide, but maybe you have reinforcements, maybe you're looking to interdict enemy supply lines, all those kind of things. It would open up a huge amount of possibilities in that, because you might be in a battle, and let's be frank, most battles in Total War, sure, battles in Total War can be awesome, cool, exciting, but very rarely do you get those battles in any campaign in any Total War game that's ever been released. Most battles are fairly one-dimensional. But it's frustrating to have to then spend time on loading screen, getting in the battle, getting out of the battle, not being able to save during that period, which, given the stability issues we've had in Total War for many years, that is a problem. But if you can have a smoother experience of like getting in the battle, getting outside of the battle, just zooming in, zooming out, then you could really have a battle just playing as part of a larger campaign, as opposed to the segregation that we currently have between battles and the situation on campaign map. Because there are issues with that. Like, say for instance, oh, I'm fighting X faction, they're bringing 10 armies, but I can split those armies, defeat them in detail without concern that those other armies are going to intervene, because it's my turn. And that is a factor. It's of course worth pointing out that how this would work with ships and multiple planets, that's a big discussion point, and how it would work in multiplayer, that's also another big discussion point, though we do currently have the ability of playing simultaneous turns in multiplayer campaigns. There is some friction, however, with that, because if any player goes into battle, then everyone that's in that multiplayer campaign goes into the battle with them. Sure, the current rules are like, we auto-resolve as much as possible, we play on lower difficulties against AI because, well, no one wants to waste time, watching Nakari fight 100 different battles in the campaign, for instance, when those 100 battles are not interesting. No one wants to see the same quest battle 100 times, but they do want the exciting stuff. So there are issues with the way things work right now. There would be issues with a better gameplay loop between campaign and battles. One could also very well argue that it would be very fitting if Total War had a real-time campaign map. Some will strongly disagree with that, saying, oh, Total War needs to be this and that. I would say Total War needs to be two things. It needs to have a campaign layer, and it needs to have a battle layer based on the context of things that are happening on that campaign layer. So that is what's important. On a campaign layer, you make decisions on moving armies, moving troops, moving heroes, moving lords, moving fleets. Whereas in the battle layer, you use those armies, you use those troops, and also those armies that have been built on the economy on the campaign layer, you use those in contextual battles based on the decisions you made in campaign. That is the core of Total War. So these epic, gigantic battles based on the context of what's going on in a campaign. That is what's essential. Some may disagree on that subject. I know many people will, but to me, that is what actually matters in Total War. As opposed to, oh, the battles need to play like this and the campaign needs to play like this. I don't think there's any reason that the campaign or battles have to be done in a very specific way. It's the context between campaign and battles that defines Total War. That way, they could also avoid the endless grind that we do have in a lot of different strategy games that are trying to do this, where, okay, you have 1,000 battles, you can try and skip some of them with auto-resolve, but you're generally going to be able to achieve a far better result in fighting an actual battle. So you're either skipping a lot of battles, which degrades the quality of the game because you're missing out on a huge portion of it, or you are embracing it, but then it just feels like an endless grind in a campaign. So neither of those is ideal. As for how the battles themselves would work or should work, well, Chapter Master Valrak had the following to say, that what he's been told is that battles are going to work kind of like Company of Heroes. we're going to have destruction. We're going to be able to destroy trees. Imagine that, being able to destroy trees in a total war game. Incredible. It's only been 20 years, 25 years with regards to that. But really, I'm thinking about Rome 1, because to me personally, like, Total War started with Rome 1. That's the first game I played in the series. I don't really care too much about Shogun 1 and Medieval 1. That's my perspective on it. But imagine having destroyable trees, destroyable terrain, or things on the battle terrain, having a lot of things in battles, but those things being able to be destroyed. We actually already have, like, things like fences and all that kind of stuff can already be destroyed in a Total War game at the moment. Trees can't, and many buildings can't, bigger buildings can't, etc., etc. So I think that level of destruction would be warranted in a 40k game. If you're fighting for a settlement, you can just burn it down, deny it to the enemy. That's your sacking ability of a settlement. And mind you, we do have Total War games where we can already do that. So just pointing out. But regards to the Company of Heroes comparison, I really think back to Dawn of War 2, specifically Dawn of War 2 Retribution. With regards to Dawn of War, sure, any Dawn of War game you take, 1, 2, 3, doesn't matter, the scale of battles in those games is far smaller than what we should have in a Total War game. The only thing that's kind of close to what we should have with Space Marines, because you don't want thousands of Space Marines of a single chapter roaming in battle. Sure, if you have multiple chapters working together, that's a different thing. But individual Space Marine units should be small. Think of like aspiring champions level small, like 4 or 12 units, or 12 models in a unit. But then when you're looking at the Imperial Guard, sure, their individual tanks would be one unit, one model, one unit. But a guardsman unit should be a company, from my perspective. So you have like 4 or a dozen Space Marines, then you have a company of guardsmen, and even more with regards to orcs. So orcs should have hundreds of models in a unit. That's kind of the big problem, though, that having a battle like that right now in Total War, where like one side might not even have 100 guys, and the other side has 10,000 guys, is not an especially great gameplay dynamic at the moment. You obviously can make it work. You can win quite easily. In fact, it's going to suit you in a lot of ways, like bring a dozen heroes or 20 heroes against 10 Skaven stacks. Those heroes will win, but it's just not workable right now. Scale issues aside, I think something like Company of Heroes or Dawn of War 2, where, yes, tighter maps, smaller maps, but that's just a question of scale. It's really just take that gameplay model and increase the scale. Maybe less unit abilities, because that's one of the things about Company of Heroes and Dawn of War, like a lot of unit abilities, less individual unit abilities, but still a focus on positioning, on cover, on destruction, and have, say for instance, 100 Space Marines or 200 Space Marines going up against 10,000 orcs. They do that in the lore, I should add. Tabletop, it's a different discussion. Of course, you then also have to consider Eldar, because Space Marines, sure, there are some chapters which are hit and run, White Scars and others, but White Scars especially are hit and run, and that's kind of the idea of like, oh, we're going to have a set piece battle, but that's not how the White Scars or many other chapters would actually fight. Like, they would not just be like, okay, we're going to directly charge into the enemy, or we're going to skirmish on this small map. No, they would run around cities, many cities, harassing enemy, doing damage, raiding, pulling back, doing some more, all that, which doesn't quite work very well. We have skirmisher units in Total War, but not on the scale we're talking about, and certainly not even on a historical scale of how skirmishing worked. Because like the Mongols, you look at the Mongols in history, they would retreat, do a false retreat for long, long distances, even weeks. Like, they would just be like, oh, we're going to kind of retreat for weeks, to get the enemy out of position, then we would turn around, and that's what the Mongols would do, turn around and defeat their enemies. That was their style of warfare in a lot of ways. They also had direct battle strategies, of course, they did embrace that too, but one of the key elements of like those nomadic armies, you look at Huns, you look at Mongols in particular, that is the kind of style of warfare that they embraced, which I think Total War has never really achieved that very well, from my perspective. Regardless, though, if you have a couple hundred Space Marines in a battle going up against 10k orcs, lines of fire, terrain, maneuver, that would work very well. And that's what Dawn of War does. Dawn of War 2 in particular, Retribution. Again, smaller scale, smaller maps, just increase the scale, make the maps wider. Sure, you can have tight portions of a map, like a city or certain locations, but then you just have a bigger map. So many approaches, many different attack vectors, line of sight, all that. I would not want to see a Total War game which has forces fighting over very, very small portions of terrain. You would obviously have forces doing that, but small forces, and then the larger battle would be, like I said, it would be gigantic, because they are gigantic in 40k. Like, you go into a hive city, that's not even just a portion of the map. That's the only portion of the planet that matters. Hives, by the way, don't take up the entire planet. There's just concentration of urban populations in certain areas of a planet. Unless you're talking about Earth, which, yes, the entire planet is a city. There's no end to it. How they manage that to do it justice is the big discussion point. Do I have any real hopes that Creative Assembly would do all the things that I'm talking about, or at least some of the things I'm talking about? Well, that's where the concern comes in, the legitimate concern that I have. I've been talking a lot about 4K as of late, but does that mean that I so desperately want it? I admit my perspective on Total War 40k is I'm very skeptical that they'll pull it off. I certainly hope they don't make it a cheap effort, but for many years now, I've kind of felt that from Creative Assembly. The way they handle cinematics, the way they handle units, the way they handle animations, the lack of lip syncing, the lack of facial animations, characters talking, all that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, there's a lot of areas where Creative Assembly, and not just Creative Assembly, a lot of strategy game developers do cheapen out. I hope that won't be the case in a Total War 40k game. But that's my fantasy unicorn level of what I imagine a 40k game would be. Like epic cinematic storytelling, decisions and stories, grand battles, but even like being able to split units or commanding individual soldiers in battles. Like, yeah, you have a battle with thousands of soldiers, you're commanding the army, but you can also, just when there's time for it, you jump in and control an individual soldier, like a captain or your lord or something along those lines. Some games do toy with this, Bannerlord, Mount and Blade in particular, but strategic command in that does leave a lot to be desired. But it is possible. At the moment, with current technology, or technology we've had for years, it is very possible. So my conclusion on this, regardless of what Creative Assembly decides to do with Total War 40k, go big. Like really big. And when I say big, I'm not talking like, oh, we need the entire galaxy. No, I mean go big on these individual systems. I think that would make for an amazing Total War game. But that's my perspective. Questine signing out. Let me know what you guys think. I'm sure there's many different opinions on this, but that's where I stand and what I would like to see. Realistically, I think that we'd probably still have to go for loading screens and battles. Okay, we'd still have that segregation between battles and campaign. But I do think the way individual battles will work will be different than what we've seen in a Total War game to date. If we see Total War 4K being about fucking line warfare, that is not a good game. I'm just going to call it out right now. That's not going to be a good gameplay experience. Questine signing out. Stay tuned.